Alright, hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about rationalistic philosophy, and some of it gets a little bit freaky because you got to remember that this stuff is based on originally based on Plato's work. And if you recall, of course, in our earlier presentation, Plato is to rationalism as Locke is to empiricism. So we've already had that discussion about it. But we're going to find that some of this rationalistic thinkers are a little bit wacky. But as a whole, what does rationalism think? That the mind is active. Remember, the empiricist had originally, and we'll talk about in the next presentation about rationalism versus empiricism and lay them side by side. But remember, the mind is active, according to a rationalist. The mind does things. The mind adds things. We're going to say, for example, sensory data alone is inadequate for describing thought, which is a way of saying, look, when sensations come into our eyes, eventually we have perceptions, but something happened between sensation and perception, and that thing that happened is a natural thing and an active thing. So the mind is going to add something to it. So by the time you have a perception, the sensation has already been modified. And trust me, we're going to get to some of this wacky stuff. We can never know the world because our mind has changed it. Okay? So the mind is not just a passive thing. It doesn't. It has structures to extract concepts. I mean, it's an active thing rather than a passive thing. A couple of precursors to rationalism. Spinoza, who denied free will completely, he says this: God is nature and nature is lawful. Lovely. Humans are part of nature, and therefore nature is lawful, and therefore humans are lawful. And just like that, that's a way of saying humans are determined. In the mind, there is not absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to wish this or that by a cause, which has also been determined by another cause, and this last by another cause, and so on to infinity. And so humans don't understand the causes, and so they think we have free will, but the fact is there is no free will according to Spinoza. And this is a little bit radical, but remember, for scientific psychology, this is one of the background assumptions that we talked about earlier, the assumption of determinism, that there are laws. Yes, I grant you, we don't necessarily have a firm understanding what the laws are. We broke it down in a previous chapter and talked about primary laws versus secondary laws. But the fact is, these laws seem to be existing. So we've got a little side note here. I enjoy this guy, Malebranche. It's a cool name, too. Nicolas de Malebranche. Okay, I love it. So he had this notion that bodily events and mental events are coordinated by God's intervention. All right? If you have an idea, okay, then God knows about that idea, and then God causes your body to act appropriately. So it's this question that your mind and your body seem to run together. It feels like I say in my mind, move hand. Instead it goes, move hand. In my mind, God picks up on it and then sends a signal down to move my hand. That's crazy, man. I like it. It's just a neat little side trip, all right? All right, so now here we get some Leibniz, man. Or is it Leibniz or Leibniz? I don't know which, but either way, this dude is wackified, man. Check out the full PowerPoint stuff and read up on this guy's monadology. We're not going to talk monadology here in this particular presentation, but man, oh man, Leibniz's monadology. Did I tell you some of these rationalist philosophers were freaks? Holy balls. So, Leibniz tries to correct Locke's philosophy. He thinks Locke is wrong, but he doesn't seem to exactly understand. If you recall, Locke had that one sticking point with his powers of the mind, and Leibniz didn't seem to really completely understand powers of the mind, so he tried to correct him. Okay, he's the one that really proposed the active mind. Okay, he said, "I'm sorry, John Locke, but the mind is quite active." Okay, which clearly means he ignored Locke's contention of powers of the mind. And he says, nothing, no idea can ever come from a sensation, okay? Because there's no possible way anything material, anything physical, can cause something immaterial like an idea, okay? And since they can't come from a physical thing such as a brain, they must already be there. So what he said is, all right, ideas are innate. Okay, but not, the ideas aren't innate exactly so much as the potential. So every idea you've ever had was in you as a potential before you were born. The experiences that you have triggered the different ideas that are already inside of you as potentials. Freaky. However, Leibniz had another thing to say that I want to talk about, which is, and again, it's a little bit off of rationalism per se, but we're on Leibniz, and it is quite an interesting thing. He had this concept of the law of continuity, and it's really interesting. He says, say, for example, there's no such thing as hot or cold, okay? My coffee is hot. No, it is in the process of getting colder, okay? Things are not hot or cold. Things are not high or low. Things are not, they're always in a matter of degree. And this is a very, very important point right here, this law of continuity. Later on, if you ever take me for something of the nature of cognitive class or a variety of other, in particular things like capstone, you'll find that I consistently refer to, there is no such thing as conservative and liberal. There's no such thing. It's a continuity. There's a continuation from one end to another. There is nobody that is completely conservative, and there's nobody that is completely liberal. You have tendencies. You tend to be more toward this direction than that direction, or something like that. But there is no such thing as any. There's no such thing as, sick versus healthy. No, I'm sorry, there's no such thing. There's degrees of sickness, degrees of health. Okay? So he says, in the same kind of way that this continuity exists, perception exists. Okay? Perception is not an all or none phenomenon. What happens is that, and we're going to get some more details on this when we get into I believe, when we talk about the psychophysics. I think it's in the next chapter. When we get to the psychophysics, because we're going to take as a very brief example, and I'll expand on it later, but you're at your audiologist, right, your ear doctor, and they're doing a test for your hearing, and what they're going to do is they're going to play a sound, but it's too low. They're going to say, raise your hand when you hear a sound, you're like, but they're playing it, they're going, beep, nothing. Beep, beep, ow, I heard that one. So does that mean that it didn't exist before that? That it's an on and an off, a yes or a no? Perception is a yes or a no? No, says Leibniz. What's happening is those perceptions are there, but they were below the level of consciousness. Okay, they were subliminal. Okay, they were below the level of consciousness, but they definitely existed. He refers to this word apperception as the conscious awareness. We can perceive things without being consciously aware of them. Conscious experience is apperception. And so he refers to, and we're going to come back to this in more detail again in the psychophysics chapter, but this becomes a dominant theme in Freud's theory, and Freud calls the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, and he lays them out as somehow these things are separate from each other, but Leibniz says, no. It's just a continuity. He calls the Lyman the border between the conscious and the unconscious mind, and hence, just a minute ago I used the word subliminal, things that are below the Lyman, by the way, Lyman is just the German word for border, and so subliminal means below the border, or below the threshold, or below that awareness in this case. Okay? And so he says, look, as each perception continually built together, eventually their combined force becomes enough to apperceive. And so in his classic example, he refers to the sound of a single wave moving is essentially soundless. But it has some sound, but you ain't going to apperceive that sound because the level's too low. But waves don't travel alone. A wave in the ocean doesn't travel alone. Instead, 5 waves, 100 waves travel together. And it is the combined sound of 100 together that turns into crash. But each one separately has no is below the Lyman and therefore would not be apperceived. Okay? And we're definitely going to come back to the psychophysics on that stuff. Well, Thomas Reid does a little bit of side note right here. He's got an interesting, in a second here, he's going to call it common sense philosophy. And he says, look, even people that deny the existence of reasoning, these empiricists, he's really crashing on here, even those who deny the existence of reasoning abilities are using their reasoning abilities to do so. Lovely. The mind reasons and the stomach digests foods, and both do their jobs because that's just what they do. All right? I like this. Reasoning is necessary because we have to control our emotions, appetites, and passions so that we can perform our duty to God. I mean, come on. That's some interesting stuff. That is just common sense, buddy. So common sense philosophy is a position that we can assume the existence of the physical world and of human reasoning powers because it makes common sense to do so. So he was rejecting all kinds of people before him. Okay, people, any of the earlier philosophers before him that had been questioning the reasoning powers, or questioning the existence of the physical world, or questioning and saying there's no such thing as primary qualities, everything is secondary qualities. Dude, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, just when a man suffers himself to be reasoned out of the principles of common sense by something by meaningless, I don't know, meaningless arguments, we may call this metaphysical lunacy. Yeah, okay, that's pretty funny. All right. And so then we got, what do I have? Another? No, okay, I got you. See, Thomas Reed, you sneaky little bugger. There you are. Now we get the eminent one, Kant. Kant was a interesting character. I mean, the guy never ever left, like, I think 20 miles from the place he was born. He never went more than 20 miles from his birthplace, and yet he was like a rock star. I mean, in the late 17th, early 18th century, he was like a rock star. This guy, at the University of, oh, I'm not going to say it because I'll get it wrong because my memory isn't that great. But his lectures were attended by the thousands. I mean, when he died, it was like a celebrity funeral. It was like as though the king had died. I mean, the whole city was just crammed. It was the world's first traffic jam. I mean, it was just crazy. Um, Now, Kant said a lot of things, but I'm going to break down Kant's major idea. I mean, the one that is by far most relevant to us. Heck, the one that even gave us the title of this presentation. And that is, he proposed this thing called categories of thought. Those innate attributes of the mind that Kant postulated to explain subjective experience we have that cannot be explained in terms of sensory experiences alone. And we've seen some of this kind of idea previously. So even Kant didn't necessarily come up with this on his own, but he did expand it. So he said, for example, the experiences of time. I mean, what the hell is time? You understand it, but there's no sensory experience you could have ever had. Unity, quantity, quality, negation. These don't have, you could never have had the experience of these things, yet somehow we can have perfectly good perceptions of them. Okay? So, what does he argue? These categories of thought, they are already inside of the baby's brain the moment it's born. A baby's born and it already has them. These categories of thought do not come from sensory experience. But what these categories of thought do is get in the way, modify. Perceptions come in. Perceptions, strike that, perceptions come in. Sensations come in. They get modified and organized by the categories of thought. What we have as a perception is we never experience the physical world directly. Okay? Because by the time we perceive it, it has already been modified by the categories of thought. Now, this is a big deal. We're going to come back to this basic idea when we get to the Gestalt psychologists, who coincidentally also happen to be German. So when we get to the Gestalt psychologists, we're going to have the same kind of thing, that the mind is active, the mind automatically does these things. We're going to talk about the Gestalt organizational principles, for example, but the Gestalt organizational principles, as we'll talk about them, is not terribly different from a category of thought. Okay, so our phenomenological experience, that is to say our perception, is a result of the interaction between the sensation and the categories of thought. So it is the mind that prescribes the laws of nature. Okay, it is our mind that creates the universe as we perceive it. It is that our mind that is at the center of our universe. Okay, what a crazy dude. I told you these guys were a little wacky. So here's a little bit of Kant's, what the come away with Kant is. according to Kant, the introspective psychology is the introspective analysis of the mind, and so it could never be an experimental science because it's an introspective analysis. Okay. Kant proposed a new study called anthropology, which is different from the way we think of anthropology today. Okay, anthropology is the study of human behavior. Okay, which is literally a behaviorism kind of thing. He said, from a very practical perspective, if you want to predict human behavior, absolutely, you can predict human behavior. But to truly understand human beings is not possible because the only way you can truly understand the human being is through introspection, he said. And so he said psychology, or truly understanding human beings, is impossible. No, not impossible, but not experimental. It's a branch of philosophy, according to this notion. Whereas anthropology, again, how he defined anthropology, is the study of prediction. And in that sense, it is a very experimental discipline. Now, Herbart, if memory serves, Herbart took over Kant's chair position at the university there, and he felt real competitive, and he set up a little competition with himself to try to fill the lecture hall with as many students that Kant had, and it was just a miserable failure. He came nowhere near it, and he had to admit his downfalls, but that's another thing altogether. But anyway, he agrees with Kant that psychology cannot be an experimental science because experimentation requires us to divide up its subject matter, but the mind is an integrated whole. We're going to come back to some of this stuff. Again, this is going to be a primary point for William James. This is going to be a primary point when I come back at one point way toward the end and start talking about divisions of psychology, the way that we've divided psychology up today. And I'm going to have a whole field day talking about how it's an artificial thing to break the discipline of psychology into these little niches. Today we're going to study cognition. We're going to pretend that social psych doesn't exist, and we're going to only talk about cognition. We're going to pretend that learning doesn't exist because we're only talking about cognition. It's like, really, dude, I don't know about that, okay? Well, he said that though you can't break up the mind for study, the activities of the mind can be expressed mathematically, therefore it can be a science, okay? And so it's quite an interesting thing. It can be a science, but not an experimental discipline. And then last but not least, here we got Hegel. Just for a moment, here we got Hegel. And didn't I tell you that the rationalists were inspired by Plato and this mystical baloney? Here's a mystical one. According to Hegel, the absolute is the totality of the universe. Okay? A knowledge of the absolute constitutes the only true knowledge, and separate aspects of the universe can be understood only in terms of their relationship to the absolute. Do you know what? Going back all the way to Plato said, true knowledge can never be gained by looking here at this world, because at this world, every dog is different. What do you learn by looking at a dog? You don't learn nothing, he said. Plato said you look to the heavens, you look to the forms, and true knowledge comes from knowledge of the forms. And even better than just knowledge of the forms, absolutely, wisdom. This is my take on it. Wisdom is not just an understanding of the forms, but an understanding of how the forms interact with each other. Okay? How the forms relate to each other. In other words, how these different things influence each other. A knowledge of the absolute constitutes the only true knowledge, and separate aspects of the universe can be understood only in terms of their relationship to the absolute. That sounds kind of wacky, but lo and behold, this is the basic concept, which is going to then later on be Piaget. Piaget? Yeah, assimilation and accommodation and concepts and cognitive development. Yep, that's exactly what it is, okay? And so Hegel foreshadows Piaget's entire theory. We'll get to Piaget later. Maybe we'll get to Piaget later. I don't remember exactly. In fact, maybe Piaget doesn't show up in this course. But anyway, all of these philosophers, even the wacky ones, have influence on later psychological thinking. So the next time we'll come back and we'll talk a brief discussion of how the rationalists and the empiricists truly differ from each other.